Sean Ross Sapp of Fightful.com here with Conrad Thompson, a guy you may know from that time he saved you a bunch of money on your mortgage, or from one of any number of successful podcasts these days. But you're going to see him at Starrcast ahead of All In. Tickets went on sale today. Conrad, how you doing?
Man, I'm excited. You know, this is something that I'm sort of looking forward to, but at the same time pretty nervous about. I'm out of my comfort zone, Sean.
Well, I mean, it's funny. It's like what you all have created with it was podcasts, and then it turned into a merchandise situation or company, essentially, where you could probably sustain a lot of this just based on merchandise, and then it became live events. Now a podcast convention, essentially. How did this come about? Like, did they approach you? Did you approach them? How does this work?
Well, I had the idea to do a wrestling podcast convention when I heard that Greg Price was not going to do the NWA Legends Fan Fest in Charlotte last year. So I guess August of 2017. So early in the year, I thought, man, that could be kind of fun. And Bruce and I had just started doing live shows, and I thought this should be something we try to put together. It didn't work out. The hotel was already committed, and I didn't want to go step out and do something that wasn't already sort of established. But I thought, hey, if FanFest is done, I could just piggyback those dates. It didn't work. So time goes on, and this all-in thing became a real thing. So I hit Cody Rhodes up, and I said, hey, you know, WrestleMania has WrestleCon. What if you had an official convention, and it was a wrestling podcast convention? He was intrigued by the idea and said, what would that look like? So I sent him an itinerary. He called me back a few days later and said, dude, we love it. Wait, how do we do this? So we worked on landing a hotel, which is not something I've ever done before, and I had to secure that and figure out the rooms and the space and the logistics. And then I sort of worked behind the scenes to try to figure out, hey, what could this look like? What could an itinerary of events look like? What days, from what times? And then lastly, once I sort of had an idea of, hey, what would be fun, now can I land the talent and get the commitments to do it? And how do they make money? And so we figured it all out, and we came down to the wire. I sort of created a hard deadline for myself where I said, okay, I'm going to put tickets on sale here. And we came down to the wire just getting it all put together. But I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to it, and tickets go on sale tonight at 8 o'clock Eastern at Starrcast.com. That's Starrcast with 2 R's like Starrcade. It's Starrcast.com.
And, of course, you have Bruce Prichard, Eric Bischoff, Tony Schiavone, who you all do shows with. But, I mean, just a ton of other names as well, like Jerry the King Lawler, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Jeff Jarrett. You've got all these connections and all these people. I mean, even people that Fightful viewers would remember in J.J. Dillon if they stayed awake for the shows that we did. But there are just a ton of people at this. How do you all go about getting a whole? I mean, you've obviously got a lot of connections. A lot of these people listen to your shows, but for those that maybe don't, how do you go about reaching out to them?
Well, you know, either myself or somebody I do a podcast with has a contact on almost everybody who's here. You know, either they follow me on Twitter or I have their number, or Bruce or Eric or Tony do. And whoever we didn't, Ric Flair does. So I was able to just snag them and then introduce myself. And luckily the podcasts have grown to the point that even though they may not know me or my name or my voice, but they know who Bruce is. They know who Tony is. And they know those guys have podcasts. So one by one, I was able to introduce myself to these guys and sort of lay out the idea and come to an agreement of, hey, here's how I think we can make money with this. And so now they're interested, and all those guys are all in, so to speak, and we're looking forward to a big event.
Is there any concern Macaulay Culkin will miss his flight? He has a history of such.
Well, you know, it's funny that you say that because we are not announcing Macaulay Culkin for meet and greets because that's not really his thing. We are just going to do some sort of fun outside of the box events, and we're still discussing exactly what that is, but he does have some pretty fun ideas, and we're going to try to find a way to bring those to life, so to speak. But on the itinerary that we've pushed out, he's not listed anywhere on there because we don't have those ideas firmed up just yet, but he will be there. He's excited to be at All In, and he's excited to participate in this event, and we're tickled to have him because it is sort of an unconventional guest for a wrestling promotion like this.
Yeah, I love his loose connection with pro wrestling. He's made a few appearances here and there, and I think it's always kind of cool because a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, I miss wrestling how it used to be. He's going to be a person who is associated with the nostalgia period of that time as well. I mean, who doesn't love Home Alone? But you recently started a podcast with Eric Bischoff, and I remember when ideas would be thrown around like, oh, well, will Conrad ever do a WCW podcast with this guy? Eric Bischoff was the natural name, but like the rap on him was that he would kind of say, I don't recall. And you've made light of that in the first couple of episodes, and it seems like he's really made an effort to not do that because he's opened up on some things that I've never really heard him talk about through dozens, if not 100 interviews. Is that like a conversation you have with him before that to say, listen, this is what goes into making a successful podcast. Don't be afraid to open up. Don't be afraid to even shit on people if you have to.
Yeah, I mean, we did have to have a bit of a conversation beforehand about, hey, man, here's what I found works with Bruce, and here's what I found works with Tony. And we just sort of talked through what that might look like and feel like. And then we taped one practice episode. And I feel like we got a lot of the bugs worked out. And obviously, as we, continue to do this, we'll get more and more comfortable together. But he's still figuring out, like, what's the delicate balancing act? Because, on the Tony show, as you've heard, we just absolutely destroy people. But it's in a fun way. Like, we're not, and we're very clear to say, guys, this is a rib. We're all in on the joke here. It's no big deal. We're trying to entertain you. Don't overthink this. But Eric sort of is a little more buttoned up and takes it more seriously and has a more analytical type A sort of approach than maybe Tony Schiavone does. But I don't think it affects the content. I do think that it's a different flavor content, but I think it's just as good in a different way. This Bret Hart stuff this past week, I'd done, 35 pages worth of notes, maybe more. And I had a real show format, and it was all predicated on Bret's book. Wah, wah, wah. I got a major curveball right away. I just didn't see coming. So I just sort of had to throw it out the window and say, well, let me figure out how I can make this entertaining, because apparently everything that I wrote down is not true.
How often does something like that happen? Because, you've mentioned the dozens of pages of notes that you take, and sometimes maybe you won't even get through it. Because, there have been a couple of shows that you and Bruce maybe had to split in two, because otherwise they were going to be 8-9 hour podcasts.
Yeah, listen, it is something that I've wanted to try to make almost like their own little story within a story. And so I sort of related to when I was a kid. My mom would read me a story before bed, and I would go over to this little bookshelf, and I had all these golden books, and I would say, hey, what do I want to hear about today? Is it Winnie the Pooh or whatever? And so there's all my Winnie Pooh adventures in that one little book. Well, that's what I wanted to do here. So if you want to know about Shawn Michaels, I don't want to just cover Shawn Michaels as a generic topic and try to think we can cover a 20-something year career in 3 hours. That's not realistic. But we can get very detailed and be forward thinking about the longevity of the show if we cover it for 1 year at a time. And if we cover 94 and then come back later and do 95 and then come back later and do 96 and then come back later and do 97, now we've ensured that we can crank out 52 episodes a year for years to come and get a high level of discussion that you might not normally have found before.
Yeah, I really enjoy the format. It really seems to work. Is there anything on the docket that that maybe people don't know about on these shows? I know that the format with Tony Schiavone has went to pretty much watch-alongs, and I think that's become a fantastic format. I think it's jogged his memory even. You get a lot less of the booking committee comments, and you get, man, that guy is just an entertaining guy. Like, Tony Schiavone is so goddamn funny that you may have never suspected it unless you caught some offhand comments during WCW Saturday Night back in the day, because he was doing what he's doing. But now it really seems like he's having fun with this again.
Yeah, he is. It took a little while for him to sort of settle in and get comfortable, but he's got his rhythm now. He's not nervous about what are we doing or how are we doing this. He's feeling it and he's having fun. And it did take a bit of a pivot, because I was originally approaching the show as if it was just going to be a carbon copy of Bruce's. I've learned the hard way that's not possible. You've got to sort of do the old Paul Heyman, and I love quoting this: accentuate the positives, hide the negatives. So let's play to Tony's strengths, and Tony's strengths are being an announcer and being off the cuff and being dirty and being foul and, just not taking it too seriously, just being silly. Tony's phenomenal at that, so why would we do anything else? Once we realized that, we just doubled down, and now we're doing watch-alongs almost exclusively.
You're also admittedly a big ECW fan. If you had your choice, who were a couple names that you would utilize for an ECW podcast? Obviously, there's a couple that stand out.
Well, I think Joel Gertner is the guy who's itching to do it the most. I've just got to find the time to do something. I'm going to hope that I can put something together with Joel for an ECW podcast. If it's not with me, maybe it's with JoJo from Conan's podcast or something like that, because I think Gertner is one hell of an entertaining dude. In a perfect world, you'd be able to talk Bully Ray or Tommy Dreamer into doing something, but the two white whales for me of an ECW podcast would be Joey Styles, who seems to be done with wrestling, maybe forever, but certainly for now, and Paul Heyman. And I don't know that Paul Heyman really wants to do a podcast right now. I mean, that's not to say never, but Paul Heyman is going to have a perspective that almost nobody else does, because he had an opportunity to work the territories. Of course, he did a lot with Crockett, and then, of course, WCW's Turner organization, ECW, and then all the stuff with the WWE in this run, well, a couple of runs now. I mean, the Punk stuff, the Brock stuff, it's just lots and lots of meat on the bone of a Paul Heyman podcast, if it were to ever happen.
Is there any particular wrestler that maybe you talk to and you're like, man, even though the podcast market is kind of saturated, you're like, goddamn, you have to have a podcast?
Yep, and it's going to blow everybody's mind when I say it, but the answer is Jeff Jarrett.
I'm not surprised at all. Not surprised at all. That guy is stories for days.
He's done everything. You talk about growing up, second generation, your dad's a promoter, you got heat with all the boys coming in right away, and then as if that's not enough, now you're going to bounce around. You're going to start working with the WWF, walk out in the middle of the biggest angle of your life, and then wind up in a good position on WCW, talk your way into being a horseman, and then find yourself back on WWF TV without a contract, sort of talking smack about the biggest draw in the history of the business and saying his gimmick is essentially sacrilegious. It's just so fascinating. And that's before we ever get to, we're going to hold you up for money and walk out and then go lay down for Hulk Hogan at Bash at the Beach 2000 and then get fired on national TV by the only promoter left and then say, you know what, I'm going to start my own company. Start a company from scratch and run out of money almost immediately. Go find funding from a guy who's going to go to prison for securities fraud, like our Alabama version of Enron. And as if that's not enough, a lady calls on him to sell him PR for his failing wrestling company. And it turns out her parents are billionaires and he saves it, but his wife passes away. So he starts having sex with the top draw in the company. This is make believe. How is this real? It's such a fascinating story. Nobody has his story. And if I can ever talk him into doing a podcast, I will make time to do a Jeff Jarrett podcast. That dude has a story like nobody has a story.
Conrad, I want to thank you so much for joining me. Of course, guys, you can go to Starrcast. That's STARRCAST.com. Tickets on sale tonight as we film this. It is May 15th, so make sure you check that out. Conrad, thank you so much.
Man, I'm excited about it. Thanks for the opportunity to come on and talk about it.